Hey everyone. Thank you all for coming out here on this Monday night. And welcome to A Lot on the Mind. This is a series that is aimed at demystifying neurological disorders and to look at the biological basis of these disorders. But more importantly, this series is to give a platform for patients to talk about their experiences and to feature their many, many talents. I'm Stephanie Rogers. I am the creator of this series and your host for tonight. And we have got a great show lined up. We've got the Huntington's Disease Society of America in the house. Go check them out. They're in the little table in the corner in the library at intermission. We have got Heidi Latsky Dance Company in the house. And we've got the Society for Neuroscience BraiNY in the house. Woo! All right. So tonight's show, we're going to talk about Huntington's disease. And our show is going to have two acts. The first act will talk about what it is, how you get diagnosed, and some research in the field. And then we'll have a brief intermission. You guys can get more drinks, start feeling more relaxed. And then we'll go into our second half, which is going to feature dances. We'll see some videos of dance with Huntington's, and we will also see two choreographed live pieces here on the stage, choreographed by Heidi Latsky Dance, and then the show will conclude for the night. So our first speaker tonight is going to give us an overview of what Huntington's disease is. How do you get diagnosed? What happens in the brain? And she'll go over sort of the clinical features. She studied Huntington's during her PhD at Columbia University, looking at how the brain actually clears this protein that's created. She now serves as the manager of the Research and Missions Program at the Huntington's Disease Society for America. So please welcome to the stage Dr. Leora Fox.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that introduction. I always like it when I get the doctor in there. I'm just going to move this out of the way and sit down. So, yeah, I'm Leora. I am just really thrilled to be on the stage of Caveat, and especially to talk about something that I'm really passionate about. I have had the privilege to learn about and communicate about Huntington's disease, both from a research perspective and now as at the Huntington's Disease Society of America. And the first thing actually that I want to ask all of you is, did anybody recognize the music that was playing, the artist that was playing as you came in tonight? I can't really see you that well, so just yell it out. Woody Guthrie, yeah, that's right. So Woody Guthrie was a folk singer who was active in the 30s through the 50s, and he sang folk songs and wrote children's songs and political songs. But he also had Huntington's disease, and he died of Huntington's disease in 1967 after a 15-year battle. And here he is with his wife, Marjorie Guthrie. And Marjorie started in that same year, in 1967, when he died, she started the organization that would become the Huntington's Disease Society of America. And we're now the largest patient-facing organization that aims to improve the lives of everyone with HD and their families. And Marjorie, for many years, really devoted her life to political and medical advocacy for HD families. There she is with Jimmy Carter. And in her professional life, she was a dancer. She danced with the Martha Graham Dance Company. She had a dance school in New York. She taught dance classes. And she said that it is a long way from the world of dance to the world of healthcare, but in another way, both depend primarily on communication. And I know that this concept of the intersection between science, communication, and performance is a really important one at Caveat and with BraiNY. And so part of the reason that we included dance as part of tonight's event is as a tribute to Marjorie's legacy. Additionally, Huntington's disease was sometimes known as St. Vitus's dance, or Huntington's chorea, it's even sometimes known now as. And chorea is a Greek word meaning dance, and it refers to the typical jerky, sometimes described as dance-like movements that are experienced by people with HD. And finally, there is a lot of evidence recently that different types of dance-based and movement-based interventions can have a really positive impact on patients with Huntington's disease and other neurological disorders. And we are going to hear more about that tonight and also do a little bit of moving ourselves. But my goal really as the first speaker tonight is to introduce you to Huntington's disease. And then I'd like to talk about one particular clinical approach that's really exciting right now and that's focusing on the genetics of Huntington's disease for the first time. So Huntington's is a progressive hereditary neurodegenerative disorder. It's a brain disease that runs in families and that gets worse and worse over time. And it causes a classic triad of symptoms that affect people's thinking, their behavior, and their movements. So people with Huntington's disease might begin to have difficulty organizing and planning and learning new things. Thoughts can get a little bit slower. They might experience depression, even suicidality, anxiety, sometimes even aggression, paranoias. And almost everyone with Huntington's disease develops a classic movement disorder, which begins with these jerky movements, involuntary movements called chorea that start in the face and limbs and progress over time. And eventually, this leads to stiffness and a lot of difficulty with day-to-day tasks. So HD is usually diagnosed when the motor symptoms begin, and on average it happens in people's early 40s, but that it can occur anytime from, say, 3 years old up until really the elderly. People with HD who are under 25, it's about 10% of cases have a form called juvenile HD. Same genetic causes, but looks a little bit different. And in all cases, HD worsens over the course of about 15 to 20 years. So in the early stages of the disease, it can affect people's personality and their relationships and how they act at work and at home and how they manage their finances, et cetera. In the middle stages of the disorder, it can affect people more physically in terms of walking and driving and personal safety, family safety. And in the final stages, people really lose the ability to walk and speak and eat and take care of themselves. This is very different for every single person with Huntington's disease, but this is the sort of classic triad of symptoms. HD is the incidence is about 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 20,000, depending on the population. There are about 30,000 people in the US living with HD and another 200,000 at risk. And I'll talk about that risk, but I also wanted to play for you a little clip from a video that HDSA recently made about a really lovely love story between Carol and Richard. And in this little clip, they're going to talk about how HD is affecting their lives and how they found out about it and what it means for their family.
I'm the first person in the family. My father died when he was young, but that was because of an ulcer, not Huntington. I'm patient 0, although that doesn't make any sense to some people.
We had no idea that this was a possibility. They were in middle school, and Richard was just moving around and acting a little strangely, and so we were going to get it checked out. I thought it was a tumor. I didn't know what it was. And when they found out it was, they said, oh, it might be this, but don't look it up. Don't look it up. You don't want to know about it. Let me tell you what it's about it. So, of course, the instant I came home, I looked it up, read the Woody Guthrie book, and I saw that sometimes people get very violent, and they had things where they come after you with a knife and all that. And I thought, oh, my gosh, this is not going to happen. This has got to go. It's okay, we'll get through it. And Richard has not been violent at all. In fact, he's really, really a sweetheart. I feel really, really lucky. He's so he apologizes about things that obviously he has no control over. And he tries his best to do everything that he can and just be no trouble to anybody. Every year, I just think, just stop it now. We can just stop it now. We can live with this. We can be okay. And I feel much more hopeful for the boys that they actually will have something for them by the time they are middle-aged.
Sorry about that sound video disconnect, but you heard Carol talking about her hope that her boys will have something for them by the time that they are middle-aged and are at risk for developing Huntington's disease. But the reality is that right now there is nothing that can slow or stop the progression of HD. However, there are lots of ways to treat symptoms. There are different medications for the psychiatric symptoms. For example, the same kinds of medications that would be prescribed for depression or anxiety for somebody who didn't have HD can be used for HD. There are also a couple of specifically chorea-focused drugs for movement symptoms. And there are lots of different types of physical therapies that can help people improve their movement and the way they communicate and eat. And there are many different types of social support that help families to cope with the different behavioral changes and manage whatever comes up. So to talk about the genetics of HD, I want to jump way back in history, and there's a really beautiful history of descriptions of Huntington's disease going way back to medieval times, but in true researcher fashion, I'm going to condense it all into the picture of the guy that we named it after. So this is George Huntington, who was a doctor on Long Island, and his father and grandfather before him were all doctors in the same community and saw generations of families with Huntington's disease. And he described this famous paper in 1872. He described the symptoms, the triad of symptoms, quite accurately. And he also quite accurately described the genetics of HD, which was actually a really big deal at the time because Mendelian genetics hadn't really caught on. So Gregor Mendel, you might remember as that guy who did all the experiments on pea plants, but it's more likely that you have some kind of trauma over having to fill in Punnett squares when you were in high school. But we know now that Huntington's disease is a dominantly inherited disorder. If one parent is affected, then there's a 50-50 chance of passing it down to a child. And HD is caused by a single gene. And to talk about the discovery of that gene, I'm going to jump to the 1970s when a team of researchers led by Nancy Wexler began visiting a very remote and poverty-stricken region of Venezuela called Lake Maracaibo. And over the course of many years, they went and visited Lake Maracaibo, and they had identified a huge family there, information about 10 generations of people who had Huntington's disease. And they began visiting and getting neurological exams and more information about this family tree and collecting samples that eventually led them to identify the gene that causes Huntington's disease. So I will just remind you quickly that our genetic code is contained within our chromosomes, and it's made up of nucleotides in our DNA, and we represent the letters A, G, C, and T represent these nucleotides. So the Huntington gene, everybody's got this gene, and within the gene, there is this repeated sequence of the letters C, A, G. And normally people have around 10 to 26 repeats of this CAG repetition, but we know that more than 40 of them leads to Huntington's disease. Now, between 27 and 39, there's some variability in how it's inherited and whether it causes symptoms, but what we know is that more than 40 of these CAG repeats always leads to someone developing Huntington's disease within their lifetime. And there's an inverse relationship between the number of CAGs and the onset of symptoms, such that the more CAG repeats a person has, the earlier the disease tends to onset in terms of the motor symptoms. There's a lot of variability there, but in general, people who have more than 60 repeats tend to develop the juvenile form, and in general, the more repeats, the earlier. So what does that actually mean? So to talk about what happens when you have these CAG repeats, I want to go to the central dogma of cell biology, which is the basic idea that DNA makes RNA, makes protein. And every set of 3 letters in the DNA ends up turning into an amino acid in a protein. So DNA, RNA, protein. And just to hammer that home, I like to use an analogy of the DNA being like a cookbook for everything you need in your cells, every RNA like a recipe, and then the protein is whatever you're cooking. So here we've got our cookbook. We want to make some cupcakes. So maybe we print out the recipe and get it all messy in the kitchen, and then we're going to bake the cupcakes. But maybe this cookbook has just this tiny little typo that tells us to add a tablespoon of baking soda instead of a teaspoon. And so that's what we're going to do with our recipe. And then we're going to get these really weird cupcakes that are cupcakes, but they're not really cupcakes that anybody wants to eat. So within the Huntington gene, there's this mutation, this CAG repeat sequence that gets translated into the RNA. And then what we get, because that CAG makes the amino acid glutamine, we get a protein with this extra long string of glutamines. And that protein is just kind of too long. It doesn't fold very well. The cell can't handle it properly. It's not very good at its job. And it also tends to accumulate in cells. So here we're looking at a slice of a mouse brain. I couldn't resist using one from my own thesis. But the expanded Huntington protein is basically forming these clumps in cells. So all those brown things are nuclei that are full of expanded Huntington. And at the same time as this protein is accumulating, there are also cells being lost in the brain. And in particular, cells that are really vulnerable are cells in the striatum. The striatum is very important for movement and mood. And you can see along those sort of weirdly shaped holes in the middle, let me see if I've got so this is the striatum, this darker pink part here, and these are the ventricles where the cerebrospinal fluid flows through. This is a human brain. And in Huntington's disease, it's those striatal cells that start to die off. And you can see those ventricles look really big, and that's because a lot of those cells have been lost. And in particular, the cells that are most vulnerable are the ones that are in charge of suppressing movements, which is a really sort of simplistic way to talk about why people begin to experience all these extra movements and changes in mood as well. So we have these two things that are happening, these 2 major pathological observations, one that this Huntington protein is gumming up the works, and the second that certain cells are being lost. And there's this kind of existing hypothesis in the field that this protein is somehow toxic and leading to the death of cells. And so the how of that has really been the subject of major research for many years. But what if we could just bypass all of that and say, lower the amount of Huntington in the brain? If this protein's really toxic and it's coming directly from this gene that we know is causative, then let's get rid of some Huntington. And so starting almost 20 years ago, we began to have evidence that if you could flip a switch and turn off the production of this mutant Huntington protein, then you could have really positive behavioral effects in mice that had been designed to study Huntington's disease. But it's really only very recently that we have been able to ask questions about turning this into a medication and really have the technology to do so. And those questions are, how do we design that medicine if we're trying to get at the gene or the protein? How do we actually get it into the human brain? And how do we then test that it's working? So if I bring you back to the cupcake analogy, we've got this typo in our recipe, we've got this crappy recipe, and then we've got these weird cupcakes. So there are different ways that we could have fewer bad cupcakes, right? We could correct that recipe itself. We could just crumple up that recipe and never use it. Or, we could make some cupcakes and then just throw them away. So I think this is a pretty good analogy for the ways that researchers and companies are working on this problem. So there are DNA editing methods that in the past few years have become really real. You may have heard of CRISPR. So that's one focus. There are methods to remove or block the RNA so it can't make protein anymore. And then there are people working on how to clean up that protein. And the methods that are kind of furthest along and closest to humans and even starting to enter the clinic are methods that remove the RNA or block the RNA. In particular, there's a type of drug called an ASO. It's an antisense oligonucleotide, but I'm just going to call it an ASO. And these ASOs, basically what they do is they stick to the Huntington RNA, and they trick the cell into destroying that weird-looking Huntington RNA that's got something stuck to it so that they can't make any more, those RNAs can't make any more Huntington protein, and the brain begins to be able to clean that up. And so we know that this has had some positive effects in animals, and the next step is testing it in humans. So the question was, how do we get this kind of drug into the brain? And the answer is that in these clinical trials, they're using lumbar punctures. It's also known as a spinal tap. Sounds kind of scary, but it's becoming increasingly it's becoming used for chemotherapy. It's been used for a very long time for epidural delivery of drugs for labor and delivery, which has definitely been on my mind recently. But so this is how these drugs are being actually delivered to the brain, because they can then circulate through the spinal fluid and through the brain. And then the spinal fluid can be tested to see whether that Huntington goes up or down. So in terms of actually clinically testing these drugs, they are in the clinic right now. It's been very exciting. And we know that these drugs have been safe so far. So a phase 1 study tests safety in a small group of people, generally less than 50. And in safety studies of these ASO drugs, there haven't been any dangerous side effects, and people have taken them for several months, and there are sort of longer studies that are ongoing for years now, and there haven't been any safety side effects. The second phase of a clinical trial is usually 100 to 200 people. It tests more of like the biology that's happening in the body, and sometimes preliminary clinical tests and stuff. And in this case, they took samples of the spinal fluid and tested it for levels of Huntington. And what we found in these studies is that people who had no drug had their Huntington levels go up over the course of the study, whereas people who got higher and higher levels of this drug had their Huntington levels go down. And this was very, very exciting news over the course of 2018. That this was possible to really genetically target Huntington in the human body. And so, of course, the question now is efficacy. Can drugs like this, can Huntington lowering really have an effect on the symptoms of what is a very complex and multifaceted disorder? And that's what is being tested right now. And the major study that's being carried out by a pharmaceutical company called Roche right now began about 2 weeks ago. And so it's sort of a long road to figure out whether these are going to be safe and help symptoms over time, but there is a lot of hope around it. And just to give you some context for how novel this is, there's really only one other drug that is approved to treat any kind of neurological disorder, ASO drugs that are approved to actually slow the symptoms of this disorder called spinal muscular atrophy, which affects infants and children and is fatal. And this drug was approved in 2016, and there are now some children living way beyond what they were expected to. So there's really a lot of hope for Huntington's disease as well through these kinds of trials. But I don't want to give you the impression that all of the field's eggs are in one basket. There are lots of different approaches. There are multiple Huntington lowering studies with different approaches that are happening now or about to start. There are also lots of other types of drug studies that are targeting completely different biological pathways that are important in Huntington's disease. There are worldwide registry studies and sample collection initiatives that are really useful for gathering data from many, many people so that it can be analyzed and we can really draw conclusions about HD from many people. And there are lots of smaller studies and interventions that have nothing to do with drugs And often these are physical therapy based or social therapy based. And we're going to hear some more about that tonight. So I just want to encourage you that if you're interested in learning more about any of these trials or about Huntington's disease, hdbuzz.net, although both probably work, is a great site where scientists write articles in plain language about Huntington's disease research. I write a weekly blog about what's going on in research, and I manage a clinical trials database called HD Trial Finder that lists all of the recruiting trials all over the US. And HDSA's website at hdsa.org has tons of information about Huntington's disease, and I really encourage you to talk to my colleague Megan Cohen, who is going to be in the back at our table if you're interested in supporting our cause or learning more about it. And I just want to thank BraiNY and Caveat for having us, and my colleagues at HDSA, everyone who helped me with this presentation at Neurite, Stephanie for hosting, and all of the dancers tonight. So thank you all very much for your attention.
Okay, so we just heard that one of the major features of Huntington's disease is the movement disorder. And our next speaker is going to dive into this a little further. So our next speaker is going to talk about how we can study this movement and how we can use things like physical therapy to help alleviate some of the symptoms. So our next speaker was actually a professional dancer and worked with the Heidi Latsky Dance Company, where he now serves on the board of directors. He's currently pursuing his PhD at the Teachers College at Columbia, where he is also an instructor. And he does movement research in the Neurorehabilitation Lab with Dr. Lori Quinn. So put your hands together for Greg Uden.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Stephanie. So I'm here today to talk about the benefits of exercise and physical therapy in people with Huntington's. But first of all, how many of you out there have heard that exercise is beneficial for you? Just raise your hand, right? Almost everybody has heard that exercise is really good for you. How many of you have heard that exercise is good for your brain health, not just your body? So not as many. And then how many of you are currently pursuing an exercise program or regularly exercising? Great, no, hey, I'm not judging, I'm not here to judge, but we're here to talk about the benefits of exercise. So exercise has been making the headlines recently, especially in regard to neurodegenerative diseases, such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and MS. Exercise increases the blood flow to the brain, which we think may have a protective effect on the brain in these diseases. This is a study that was conducted in 2015 by a group of Italian researchers. So here you can see that on the vertical axis, we have L-DOPA, which is a drug that is used to treat Parkinson's, to treat the symptoms in Parkinson's disease. And then on the horizontal axis, you see the different time points. The graph with the circles shows the control group, and then the graph with the squares on the bottom shows the people who received an exercise training. So what we can see at the onset is that both groups have the same amount of dosage of this drug at the beginning. But as time continues in this trial, the group that did not receive exercise training actually needed to increase their dosage, whereas the group that participated had a much smaller dosage and did not increase as much. So this tells us that exercise may have the potential to delay the need for some of these pharmacological interventions. We know that medication is important, but that exercise may be an important adjunct to this. That this model of adjuncting with exercise is seen in other neurodegenerative diseases, such as Parkinson's and MS, where exercise is critical to the management of the disease. exercise drives neuroplasticity. That just means that the brain has the power to change itself. That through exercise, we can actually improve some brain function. We were talking about brain health. So exercise can strengthen the circuitry of the brain, and it can also lead to improved motor behavior. So some of the symptoms of Huntington's disease is slowness of walking, the chorea, which we talked about, and impaired balance control. So that exercise has the potential to improve these. Robert Butler said, if exercise could be packaged into a pill, it would be the most widely prescribed and beneficial medication in the nation. But exercise is not a pill, right? It's hard to get people to exercise. This cartoon by Ed Fisher just highlights that point for me. So you can see the doctor here in the middle who's telling the patients, oh, you should exercise. So they're learning about exercise from their doctor. And then in the corner over here, small, you see the news station saying that exercise is the key, similar to those headlines that we saw in the first slide. But the patients are still saying, yes, yes. Now seriously, what can we do to improve our health? Exercise is not that pill, right? We have to get people to do it, and that can be difficult. Getting to the gym is not always something that we want to do. We have this anecdotal evidence from other diseases, but what does the research say in Huntington's disease? About 15 years ago, we only had a handful of studies, and these studies were primarily case studies that focused on one participant and followed them over time. Now, more research scientists are interested in the effects of exercise, not only in Huntington's disease, but in other neurodegenerative diseases, which we saw. We are now at a point where we have over 20 intervention studies in people with Huntington's disease, but 17 were conducted between the years of 2013 and 2016. So we now see that there's this boom in what we're researching and studying for how exercise may have that neuroprotective effect. With this amount of research, we're now able to start to summarize some of those results. And that's exactly what Nora Fritz and her colleagues did. They conducted a systematic review using mixed methods. Mixed methods means that they were including quantitative and qualitative studies in their review. The quantitative studies are ones that we have measurable outcomes for, such as walking and balance. And these qualitative studies focused on the attitudes and the perceptions of not only the participants, but also their families and their caregivers. So the results of this showed that there were preliminary support for the motor benefits. So there was improved motor function, they were able to increase their walking speed, and they were able to improve their balance as a result of exercise. This group also was able to identify facilitators that would help people engage or uptake exercise and participate in more physical activity. There were personal factors. These are factors such as self-efficacy. If they know that exercise is important, they may be more motivated to participate. There were external factors. This is the identification and the commitment of the caregiver, possibly the family members as well. It's building that support team around that individual to help them and support them to engage in this new physical activity. Personalized training and structured training, setting a schedule, that helps for all of us, right? If we're doing something that we enjoy, we're much more apt to do it. And if we're setting a schedule, it may even become a habit. Lastly, that participating in exercise as a group had this social component to it that was very important to them. It gave them not only that sense of community, but that sense of support. At the Neuro Rehab Lab at Teachers College at Columbia, we're actually doing studies now to get people with Huntington's to actually engage in exercise. So one of the studies is this PACE HD study, and this is being led by Dr. Laurie Quinn and her colleague Monica Bussa, who's at Cardiff University in the UK. This study has 120 individuals with Huntington's disease. We're also still currently recruiting for this study. We're looking at physical activity and fitness through the use of wearable technology. Wearable technology such as the Fitbit and the Apple Watch allows us to track movement and to measure how much physical activity these people are having. One of the unique things about this study is that we're also including measures such as heart rate and VO2 max, which VO2 max is a measure of cardiorespiratory health, and that this allows us to start to quantify that dosage of exercise. This is through the frequency, the duration, and the intensity. One of the unique things about this study is also that it is both a natural history and a within cohort randomized control trial. So some of the participants will come in, we'll measure them and collect the data at baseline, and they'll come in 1 year later, continuing their activity as normal, and we'll just recollect the data. Other people will be randomized into this coaching study, where they'll be paired with either a physical therapist or a coach who will help them to engage in physical activity. They receive a disease-specific workbook, and then they work to create those personalized training plans and that structured schedule to support them to engage in this. We also have pre-active PD. This is an exciting study. This is one of the first studies to actually prospectively look at people in the earliest stage of the disease to try to get them to uptake or increase their physical activity. And we believe that at this stage, this is the most critical. Most of the research has focused in those middle stages, but now we're trying to see if we can actually get people to start earlier. Does that actually have an effect, possibly slowing the disease? We know the benefits of exercise. We've been talking about the benefits of exercise. But exercise typically follows more of a piecemeal approach. We tend to work on one part of the body at a time. It doesn't always include the person as a whole. It doesn't really have an emotional connection to it. You can kind of just use the leg press machine and go for reps and see how many you can do. This is where dance may be a beneficial intervention. It might allow us to kind of hide that exercise pill in a very beneficial package. So dance has these other components to it. Dancers not only memorize movement, but they're also expected to time this to music. So there's more of this cognitive engagement. Also, often choreographers or teachers ask dancers to make up or improvise their own movement. So dance has these key tenets of motor learning that is already inherent to dance that we can just capitalize on. Dance has repetition through movement. There's intensity of practice. There's the use of motor imagery. All of these things are really beneficial. However, dance in and of itself is not fixing a problem. Dance is learning an art form. And this is something that I would always talk about with Heidi Latsky when I was in her company, that we were making art, not providing therapy. More research scientists now are getting interested, though, in the beneficial and therapeutic effects that dance may have. One of these researchers is Madeline Hackney at Emory University. She studies the use of social dance, specifically partner dances such as tango, and looks at their effects in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. Her research has shown that dance not only has these motor benefits on walking and balance, but that it can also have an effect on cognition and on quality of life. In Huntington's disease, the research is more limited, but we have anecdotal evidence from people such as Paul Dennis, which Leora showed the video earlier. One study that we do have is using Dance Dance Revolution. Dance Dance Revolution is a video game. You have these arrows which are on the floor in front of you. So there's 4, one in front, one behind, to the right and to the left. And then those arrows will appear on the screen and you have to match your movement to the timing of the music. So the researchers in this group asked 18 participants with the middle stages of Huntington's disease to play this video game. It was for 45 minutes, twice a week, for 6 weeks. The participants not only reported that they enjoyed doing the dancing, but they also wanted to continue after the intervention finished and after the study finished. More importantly, though, they increased their score of the game, which means that there were these improvements that were happening, but they also were able to carry over these improvements into overground walking. So that we saw this transfer effect both from the video game to real life, and that was also more motivating for these people. Now, I can't stand up here and just talk about exercise without asking you guys to do a little movement yourself. I'll do that in 1 second, but I'm gonna first talk about the 4 recommendations for any exercise program. So the American College of Sports Medicine recommends that you have aerobic exercise such as cycling, running on a treadmill, or even dance. Resistance training, which can be weight training, but it can also be things such as push-ups, or we'll do some squatting or some sit to stand in a second. We'll also be doing a little bit of stretching. Yoga and Pilates are really beneficial for this. And that there's neuromotor or balance training. Tai Chi, yoga, dance, all also fall within this category. So the American College of Sports Medicine recommends that you get 150 minutes of moderate exercise a week. This includes activities such as brisk walking or just riding on a bicycle. Or you can do 75 minutes of vigorous activity. This means that you're sweating and out of breath. This is the really difficult exercise. You can also do some combination of the two depending on what you enjoy. So we'll go ahead, I'll do some light stretching and we'll do some exercises now. So I'm gonna ask Stephanie to go ahead and come up and she's gonna demonstrate for me. You'll all be doing this with me, so it's not just Stephanie. So we'll start with that flexibility or that stretching component. So what I want you to do is to just take one leg forward and in front of you and pull the toes back towards your face. And then go ahead and lean forward and feel that stretch in the back of your legs. So people with Huntington's often get a lot of stiffness in their muscles, and this is one way that we can stretch and try to open that up. Go ahead and do the other side. Yeah, let that feel good, right? After sitting in that chair. Great, and then come back to seated. So we'll also work on a little bit of rotation or some trunk mobility. So I want you to go ahead and look to your right and try to see behind you. Yeah, you can use your hand on the chair and you can really try to stretch. And then do that to the other side. So people with Huntington's often end up with stiffness in the trunk and this limited range of motion. So this is one way that we can start to open that up. So now we're moving on to that resistance. So Stephanie's going to demonstrate a sit-to-stand exercise, which is one of the exercises that's included in the Enroll Registry study. So if you can go ahead and cross your arms, and then just stand all the way up. And then sit back down. So now I'm gonna ask you all to do that. So go ahead, we'll just take one practice to make sure you don't bump into anyone or knock over any drinks, and then sit back down. So I'm gonna time you, and I want you to see how many of these you can do in 30 seconds. I'm not counting, I won't be looking, but I just want you to see how many you can do. Okay. And go. You have to get all the way up, no halfway movements. Yeah, we might get a little sweaty, right? We might get our heart rate up a little bit. I want you to see how many you can do. We're about halfway there. You might be getting tired a little bit. Don't worry, the next one's easy. Great, 5 more seconds. Keep going and keep counting because this is up to you. Okay, and that was 30 seconds. So that's a nice little way to like break up your day, right? And get some movement going in there. It also will help to like build and tone those muscles. So the last ones that we'll do, we'll work on that motor, on the neuromotor and the balance exercises. So if everyone can just stand up one more time, we're not doing any more up and down though. So make sure that nothing's around you, and I just want you to pick up one leg and then just try to balance on that. If balance is something that's difficult for you, feel free to put your hand on the chair, to put your hand on the table, and just to give yourself a little bit of support. You're also in heels. Go ahead and switch to the other side. One side might be a little bit better than the other, right? But we're trying to work on that improvement of balance, right? If we practice it, we'll get better at it. Great, thank you very much. Can we now give Stephanie a round of applause for being the beautiful assistant? So just to bring it back for a second, the things that we talked about today were that exercise is beneficial, which we knew, but that exercise can also be beneficial for your brain health, and that exercise has the potential to possibly slow disease progression or even reduce the need for these pharmacological interventions. And that dance might be a great way to kind of hide that exercise pill so that people don't even realize that they're doing all of this exercise. So I just wanted to also give my thanks to Caveat and to BraiNY, and then to Leora and Stephanie for inviting me up here today. And then I also wanted to give a thanks to my advisor, Dr. Lori Quinn, who first introduced me to Huntington's, and without who I would not be here today. And then I also want to give thanks to Heidi Latsky, whose work you'll see a little bit later. Thank you very much.
Whew, I feel healthier already. Also, that might have been like the most workout I've done in a solid week, so oops. Gotta work on that. But those are great exercises to do at work too. Like, as long as your boss doesn't sit near you so he doesn't see you like doing your squats, it's a great way to get some exercise in work. So with that, we're gonna keep the night rolling. You're gonna have a 10-minute intermission, and then we'll come back for the dance portion of the night.